we're both really passionate about the healing power of food and what it can do for a whole variety of different conditions. But I think what happened to you in your early 20s really shows just how powerful food can be. So I wonder if you could take us through what happened, how old were you, what were the health problems that you were struggling with?
Yeah.
And how did you sort of go ahead and deal with them?
I started having palpitations, and I remember vividly the first time I had it. I was sat at the nurse's station, casually writing in my notes, and I could feel nauseous and my heart beating through my shirt. I could almost see it jittering on my chest. And I turned to my registrar and I was like, look, I feel my heart's going a little bit faster. Would you mind feeling my pulse? And literally within 5 minutes, bleep taken off me, hooked up to a cardiac monitor, and the ECG showed barn door atrial fibrillation. So it was an AF, which is an irregular heart rhythm where your heart beats irregularly, and in my case, very, very fast, so like 200 beats per minute. And that was my first experience of being a patient myself. Up to that point, I think if I'm being honest with myself, I had that sort of austere authority. Like, I'm a junior doctor, I've got this stethoscope, I'm charging up and down the ward, speaking to patients, really leaning into that idea of like doctor, that sort of that identity that was quickly stripped away from me. In an instant, I was in a patient hospital gown. I was hooked up to a cardiac monitor. I was this is a memory that I have, being wheeled down the corridor, everyone else minding their own business. But for me, that was so embarrassing. So embarrassing, seeing all those people walk past me and me being in a hospital gown when moments before I was in the corridor, probably attending to patients that I'd been seeing. Do you know what I mean? And
it's 24 at the time?
Yeah, I was 24.
24.
Unusual, very rare.
And in good health until then, would you say?
You would say that. Generally good health. So,
as in no kind of diagnosis or pre-existing condition that anyone knew about.
Exactly. Yeah. So nothing in my family to suggest that I would have any cardiac problems. I wasn't overweight.
Yeah.
I didn't have any blood work issues. I'd never, had any, I wasn't even drinking caffeine at the time. There was nothing in my personal medical history that would have predisposed me to having this issue. And that was the start of my journey as a patient. Luckily, I didn't need a cardioversion. I left the hospital the next day, going back to work a few days later, actually, with some medications, an antiarrhythmic, pill in the pocket, we call it, flecainide. And
were you scared?
I was definitely scared. The moment my parents came to see me, actually, when I was in the cardiac assessment unit, and my mum was putting on a brave face. But when she saw the cardiac monitor and she saw the wires and all the rest of it, I could see that she was a bit freaked out. And that honestly made me a bit scared as well. Even though I was a doctor, I knew what was going on. But that was scary. And what was scary was the lack of control, because this wasn't a one-off episode, as I came to find out. I thought it might be a one-off, maybe I didn't have enough water that day, maybe I was a bit stressed, maybe I hadn't slept properly. There's a whole bunch of reasons as to why someone might flip into atrial fibrillation as a one-off, but then it would happen again and again, 2 to 3 times a week, lasting anywhere between 12 and 36 hours, 200 beats per minute. It was a chronic issue that was seemingly getting worse.
And the first time it happens, you're in the hospital. Did some of the time it happen when you're trying to relax at home or you're out with your friends, and what are you experiencing at that time? Yes, you can feel your heart beating, but is it hard to take a breath? I mean, just paint a picture of what that's like.
Yeah, absolutely. I would love to have said that it was a triggering event, whether it was stress at home or hospital, but honestly, I could be going to play tennis and just about getting my racket out of the bag, and then I'd flip into AF. That was incredibly frustrating. Sometimes I'd be having dinner and I would just flip into AF. There was no seeming pattern of why I was having these issues. And when I was having that, it was nausea, it was a bit of sweatiness, it was an uncomfortable feeling that I'm about to faint. it almost felt like a bit of a panic attack. And there's probably some stresses involved in that as well that lead you to that sort of impending doom. But this was a real physical symptom that I caught multiple times on ECGs, because there was a suggestion from a number of different cardiologists that I saw at the time. I saw a whole bunch about what type of arrhythmia this was. Was it a re-entry pathway? Was it barn door atrial fibrillation? Was it flutter? But we found out after doing some electrophysiology studies, which is where you put a guide right into the heart and you look at the electrical impulses and seeing where they're coming from, that this was definitely atrial fibrillation. But it was almost it was not knowing when it was going to happen as well. That was really frustrating.
That lack of control. I mean, whether it's with your case or if I think about just any number of patients, when there is that lack of that there's no sense of control over when this may or may not happen. It's very disempowering. Even the idea. And we'll get to this later, this idea, I've always felt strongly that I have to be able to empower a patient in front of me in some way, that they feel they've got some degree of agency over what happens to them, because without that, it's really challenging. Yeah. So you get this in your early 20s, the, I guess, prime of your life, you just qualified, you want to go out and actually learn the skills and, make your way in the world. And something holds you back. You have atrial fibrillation, you have this irregular heartbeats. So you've seen the cardiologists. What happens? Well, you obviously had some pills that you could take. If you ever go into atrial fibrillation, you can take the pill to help you. But, what happened? Because there's a very powerful story here in terms of how you empowered yourself, made some changes, I think advised by your mum. Tell us a little bit about what happened, what the conventional medical profession advised that you do, and what you ended up doing. And I think it tells a huge story as to where you are today.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think it's important to say from the outset, either path would have been perfectly acceptable. I've had some close friends of mine actually later on in their life experience similar things to me, and they've gone down the conventional medical path, and some with success, some not so. But at the time, I was offered something called an ablation, which is where you burn an area. It sounds a bit awful, but you isolate an area around the pulmonary vein where you have these misfiring cells that cause atrial fibrillation, this irregular pattern of beating. And as a 24-year-old with no pre-existing issues, with no weight problems, nothing, I was a really good candidate for this. And this was being sold to me by a number of different senior colleagues, really esteemed people, some of the best cardiologists in the country, if not globally. And on the other hand, I had my mum with no pre-existing medical qualifications, very smart woman, analytical, runs her own business, investment banker, has done a whole bunch of things. She was like, you really need to look at your diet and lifestyle before you allow someone to burn a hole in your heart, which is the exact way she described what the procedure is. It's not as gory as it is. She described it. And honestly, to appease her, I was like, okay, fine, I'll take 6 months. I'll delay this procedure for 6 months. I got the blessing of my cardiologist and said, look, you're going to need this procedure at some point. Take the medications in the meantime. If you want to do some weird, wonderful stuff with your diet, fine. But you're going to need to come back at some point. And so I had nowhere to start, really. I mean, my mum would suggest a few recipes and that kind of stuff. And luckily, I had the ability to cook. My mum actually taught me how to cook before I went to med school. She taught me a couple of recipes. One of them was a Thai lemongrass curry. So I got a new identity when I was at university that, this guy can cook. He can make this like wonderful curry. And so to keep up this pretense, I would always learn new recipes, and I would be that experimental person, in my house share. And I loved it. I absolutely loved getting into cooking and stuff. So I applied that knowledge of flavor building to healthier ingredients. And it was a very simple thing at the start. I would have cereal in the morning, I'd have a sandwich at lunch, and I would have pasta in the evenings. That was like my normal quote unquote diet. if you analyze that, with a critical eye, there's a lot of refined sugars, there's lots of inflammatory fats in there. What I was having was most likely going to be on the go, so I probably was impacting my digestive system. You compound that with all the other insults that I was likely having on my microbiota, on my sleep, on my stress levels, all these different things may have contributed to atrial fibrillation. It's still quite arguable. But to start off, I started really simply. Out went cereals in the morning, in came oats and nuts and seeds and leftovers from the night before. Very, very simple changes. And that catapulted into me bringing in Tupperware. And I got labeled Tupperware boy by my consultant.
So you'd cook foods, whole food, and bring it in?
Absolutely, yeah.
Things like what? Do you remember?
Yeah, dark green leafy vegetables, bit of miso, some pumpkin seeds. It wasn't really recipes. It was like non-recipe recipes. It was just whatever I thought looked healthy and whenever I did a little bit of research and I was like, oh yeah, this is meant to be better for me. We didn't have any nutrition training back then.
So just from what you had picked up from society or your mum or, I don't know, magazines.
Yeah.
So
essentially, yeah.
Like, oh, I think this is healthy.
Yeah.
Healthier. Let me focus more on these sorts of foods.
Absolutely. Yeah. I didn't have a grounding in nutritional medicine at that point in time to really give me the blueprint or the guiding principles behind what I should be eating. It was sort of a bit of intuition. How do I feel after I eat this?
Yeah.
Do I feel sluggish like I would having that pasta bake at the hospital? Or should I add a little bit of greenery in there? Would I, look at some recipes and try and add like a side to it? Yeah, absolutely. I would do sides of whatever was seasonal, some root vegetables. Again, like nuts and seeds, quality fats always kept on coming up for me because it added crunch and texture and taste.
So it's really interesting to me. Your mum says, before you burn a hole in your heart, why don't you think about changing your diet and lifestyle? Which actually is a very reasonable thing to say,
yeah.
Right? And actually, you can think about, well, as doctors, as a profession, why do we not say things like that more often about a whole variety of different things? Look, we've got these medications and treatments. Before we go down that route, what would happen if you did 6 months of a change to your lifestyle? So you start changing your diet. And a couple of things there you said. One was, oh, how do I feel when I have this compared to the pasta bake from the hospital canteen? Right, so that's really interesting to me. Did you start to notice, because you were doing it for your heart, right? But what were those short-term things you started to feel immediately when you changed your food intake? And when did it dawn on you that actually this might be having an impact on this potentially more serious condition of this heart complaint, the atrial fibrillation?
Yeah. Definitely becoming more intuitive about how I felt afterwards was something that my mum taught me how to do. She was like, just check in with yourself after you eat and just see, if that, she was very, very vague about things. That was the thing. I was, coming from a medical background, I was quite analytical. I wanted to see results. I wanted to see the impact of it. And that answers your second question, because I was really fastidious at tracking when I had episodes, what I'd done before that, how long that episode was for, and how frequent said episodes were. So I had like a whole notes file and all these different things. And after practicing some of these different dietary hacks, combined with some lifestyle ones as well, actually, because my mum actually taught me how to meditate when I was a teenager before my GCSE exams. So I had the knowledge of meditation that I started to practice at the same time as all these dietary impacts as well and all these dietary changes. And so that combined with everything, I think has definitely part of the story, definitely, paved the way as to how I feel today and how I feel about lifestyle medicine in general. But what I started to notice was that the time in between different episodes started increasing. Instead of it being 2 to 3 times a week, it would go once a week.
Between these heart episodes?
Between these episodes. That would last 12 hours, 36 hours or so.
And you could draw a correlation. You could say, wait a minute, like this used to be 3 times a week. Now it's only once a week. So it's not gone, but it's getting better. Was that enough to keep you motivated?
That was a small motivating factor. But then again, I spoke to one of the cardiologists that I was seeing at the time, and I said, look, I've noticed this pattern. And I didn't actually have the confidence to tell that person about what I was making, what changes I was making myself actually.
Yeah.
And I remember saying to us, I'm noticing a pattern that it's not as frequent. And they kind of brushed it off. They're like, you can go through a period of quiescence, I think they called it at a time.
Because, of course, food and lifestyle have nothing to do with this.
Exactly, yeah. And to be fair to them, I hadn't told them about the changes that I was making. But it was, it wasn't like, oh, interesting, let's monitor you for a little bit longer. Or maybe the medications are kicking in. Or maybe it's, because of some of the other,
Were you taking medication during this time as well? Or was that it was an as and when medication, like when you flip into atrial fibrillation, you take something, or were you taking something to prevent it coming on?
So initially I was on a beta blocker persistently. Right. I came off that very quickly. It was within 4 weeks. So I did not like the side effects. A lot of people can experience depressive-like symptoms. They can have libido issues. It can impact your sleep.
Yeah.
There's a whole bunch of reasons as to why people come off beta blockers, even if it was a cardioselective beta blocker that I was on. And so I was left with flecainide. So like you said, an antiarrhythmic that is actually not very nice to take. You actually get a real sort of nauseous feeling for a number of hours after you take it. So it wasn't a perfect solution, but it was something that kept me from the impact of atrial fibrillation. Now, I should probably point out the reason why atrial fibrillation is problematic is because when your blood is pumping in an irregular way, your blood becomes sticky. All those different particles are pushing and bumping into each other, which makes that blood sticky, which makes you more at risk of clots, which is why atrial fibrillation is associated with things like strokes and even ischemic events in different parts of the body.
And stuff, yeah.
Exactly, yeah. And so that was certainly something that crossed my mind at the time, but I persisted with it. And that little motivation around diet and lifestyle was like, okay, maybe I should just carry on, and maybe I should compound this with yoga and flow and all these things that my mum was talking to me in the background. You know what it's like with mums. When they say you should do something, you're like, nah. You kind of brush it off. But she was very tactical about the way she would approach these things with me. She was like, oh, I heard this thing about yoga. It's really interesting, isn't it?
Yeah.
Instead of, you should do this, you should try and practice this, you should, instead of giving me rules around it, it was almost like a subtle suggestive hint about something that could improve how I was feeling.
It's really interesting. I think the approach your mum has taken, I think we can all learn quite a lot from that. But what was that moment? So you've gone from 3 a week, you change your diet, you go off the beta blocker, so you're not actually taking anything unless you go into atrial fibrillation, but you're changing your diet, doing a bit of yoga, doing a bit of meditation, you're noticing the frequency come down to 1 a week. Then what happens? Does it at some point, I don't know, does it at some point stop?
Yeah. So I've still got the notes actually with all my ECGs and all the sort of clinic notes and stuff. And there's a moment where I have this realization, and I look and I'm like, it's been 2 months. And then it goes to 3 months.
With nothing.
And then it just carries on. And I remember having that conversation again. And this time I spoke about diet and lifestyle. And again, like, I don't want to make it seem as if every cardiologist is dismissive of diet and lifestyle. There are plenty out there, especially now, that are coming around to this idea of just how powerful it can be. But at the time, it was just seen as, again, a period of time where it goes away, it will likely come back, it will likely stick around. And we should still really push ahead with some of the interventions that are a little bit more aggressive. And so that realization was huge for me, because at this point I'd done a bit more research into it. I was looking at things like the microbiota, inflammation pathways, specific types of ingredients, looking at it with like a more of an analytical mind. And it actually changed my practice as well. It changed what I wanted to do. I was sort of hell-bent on being a surgeon when I started. And so that realization, the idea of, well, maybe I should do something like general practice where I can have conversations with people about other aspects of their diet and well-being, as my experience of GP was when I was an F2 20 odd years ago.
So you have your first episode at 24. Do you remember when you had your last episode of atrial fibrillation where your heart was beating this fast?
No. I don't. That's so weird. I don't have a vivid memory of the last time.
Because I guess it's like a lot of things. It's like when you've had backache for years and then you don't kind of remember. It's almost, oh, I don't have it anymore.
Yeah,
like, oh, my life isn't being held back anymore by that thing.
Yeah.
And so, do you think that was within a year of it starting?
Yeah, it was just over a year.
Just over a year. About a year or so since quite a scary thing happening at 24.
Yeah.
And a condition, atrial fibrillation, which people wouldn't naturally draw a link between diet and lifestyle. I think what's so powerful about that for me is that when we talk about food and its impact on our health, I think for many years, the prevailing narrative in society and within our profession is, we can see a role with obesity and type 2 diabetes, right? There's kind of an obvious link there. But I don't think that link has been made for many years with other things, whether it's how fast we age, depression, gut problems, libido, electrical heart issues like atrial fibrillation. Do you know what I mean? I think that really speaks to this healing power of food, and that you change your diet and your lifestyle and you no longer have atrial fibrillation.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's that between how powerful diet can be for a collection of different issues that has plagued our thinking around diet and lifestyle in general. Like you eloquently demonstrated on your show the impact of diet and lifestyle beyond the traditional ways in which we view it, which is cardiovascular disease, reducing cholesterol, and obesity. No one's really going to argue much with that. But when you're applying those same principles, which are very simple, to mood, to chronic pain, to cognitive disorders, brain fog, all these issues, you then see the links that it's all foundational. So what I was doing in retrospect was building the resilience for my body to look after itself. And that is something that I want to try and instill in as much people as possible, because I think the term food as medicine can be sometimes misinterpreted as food as the pharmaceutical, food as a pill. One of the things I wrote about in my first book, actually, food is not a pill. It's not a symptom killer. It's a way in which you can build a more resilient body and mind such that it can take care of itself. And it sounds a bit out there, but that's generally what I believe and what I can see from the research.
With all the training in nutritional medicine you've done since then, all the studying you've done, the 3 best-selling books, the podcast, the new app, which we're going to talk about, you've gone deep into the weeds of the science of nutrition and how it can help. If you reflect back now, what do you think was going on, right? What was going on that you were having heart problems, scary heart problems, right, at such a young age? What do you think changing your diet and lifestyle actually did? Have you thought about that? Have you got some ideas?
I've thought about it a lot. And it's really hard to pinpoint just one thing. And I don't think it is one thing.
And we don't need to.
Exactly.
That's the model we get taught. What thing was it? Well, maybe it's a combination of everything.
And this is the thing that dogs nutritional medicine in general, because we can't envisage a world where we can test multiple factors simultaneously. We can only really think about that randomized controlled trial model where you add an intervention, whether it be a supplement or a pharmaceutical, to someone's regime, and then we observe an impact, and we control using placebo, and we take time to make sure we've got the right cohort, etc., etc. In my N of 1 case, it's likely going to be a bunch of different things. So We could look at the microbiota, for example, the population of microbes that live in and around us, all over our body, largely concentrated in the large intestine, foundational to our health, inseparable from well-being. We know now about what it can do to improve the lining of the gut, improving the functioning of our natural immune system, how it impacts with our mood, how it impacts on inflammation pathways, how it balances sugar. What I was doing by changing my diet very broadly, without going to specifics, from a pretty processed diet, if I look back on it and actually look at it with more of a critical eye, to something that was more whole food. And it doesn't need to be like raw food. It wasn't anywhere near as well as I eat today, even actually.
It was just better than the norm.
It was just better than the norm, exactly. That had a dramatic impact, as we can see now from research, on improving the functioning of those microbes. That include bacteria, fungi, viruses, nematodes, a whole selection of different microbes that we're learning a lot more about even today. And that shift can happen very quickly. I know in my case, it took quite a while before I observed quite an impressive reversal of my condition. But even in some studies, as short as a few days, you can drastically change the population of your microbes. So me consistently eating well and changing it from processed to unprocessed would have definitely had an impact on multiple levels.
So the gut microbiome is one thing that now, with all the knowledge you've got, reflecting back, it's like, well, I had more whole foods, less refined processed foods. So my gut health improves, and as my gut health improves, that can help a whole variety of different things in my body. Any other theories?
Absolutely. So by having a lot more greens in my diet, just general greens, I mean, I was having whatever I could at that point in time. We know, looking at inflammation pathways, the impact that greens can have at a cellular level. So they have what we call a hormetic effect. So people see foods that we intake as having a direct anti-inflammatory effect, i.e. when I have turmeric, for example, that's going to reduce my inflammation levels. Actually, what's happening is that it is activating our endogenous anti-inflammatory pathways. So having a mild aggressor like turmeric actually does, it actually aggravates some of our cells. We have a net benefit overall. I use the analogy of exercise. So when you exercise, you're actually shearing your muscles. You're creating quite a stressful event in your muscles and your physiology. Puts your blood pressure up, increased cortisol levels, increased sugar. If you looked at a snapshot, it doesn't look like a very healthy thing to be doing. But the net effect on that, on dementia, on mood, on cardiovascular disease, massive improvements. So at a similar level, that's kind of what we're doing with food as well. So me having a collection of all these phytonutrient-rich foods, so these plant chemical-rich foods, was having that net benefit at an inflammation level in my cells as well. So that's definitely another element of it. So you've got the microbiota, you've got inflammation. Something else that I think is harder to prove in my case was perhaps having a selection of different foods that were nutrient dense, that had more things like magnesium in, or selenium, or vitamin B12.
What does nutrient dense mean to you?
So nutrient dense to me means less processed, such that it contains a lot more of those bioavailable micronutrients. So things like vitamins and minerals, but also those plant chemicals, of which we know there are thousands. Polyphenols come up quite a bit in things like berries and coffee, and other anti-inflammatory chemicals that you find in greens like sulforaphane, indole-3-carbinol, all the indoles, all the glucosinolates. That for me is nutrient dense. And when you look at that processing pathway, that the spectrum of processed versus unprocessed, the more refined your food, the less nutrient dense it is, because we're stripping away bit by bit all those different nutrients.
It's incredible. You were describing there all kinds of benefits that you get from, let's say, greens. The way you were talking, it made me think that within these foods is a whole pharmacy of medicinal compounds that are doing different things. Let's talk about food as medicine.
Yeah.
Because Well, before we do, what would your mum say? If someone said to your mum, is food medicine? What do you think her answer would be?
She would be the absolute champion of that statement.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Without a shadow of a doubt. And it's not because it's something that she has developed a belief for, it's because it's a reflection of her cultural heritage.
Yeah.
This is something that we have known for millennia and we've chosen to ignore, maybe not in a negative light, but certainly something that we've forgotten about.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So your mum would 100% say food is medicine. But this term food is medicine has become in some circles a bit divisive. And I didn't really know about this divisive movement, or that I didn't really know much about, that people were questioning that. But many of my followers have brought certain things to my attention, say, hey, look, what do you think about this term? A lot of people are saying we shouldn't be using it. You've been in the public eye for a number of years now, promoting, with your own story, but also with your cookbooks and all your amazing content on social media. You're helping people understand just how powerful food can be. Do you consider it to be medicine?
I definitely do. And the reason why is because when I think about all the different things that I do as a clinician and what constitutes medicine, it would be naive of me to belittle medicine as the prescription of pills and the practice of interventions like surgery or minor ops, or even the application of psychotherapies as that's medicine. By us having a conversation, or by you having a conversation with someone, or someone listening to this, it is medicinal in lots of ways. Yeah. Absolutely. By me showing empathy to someone, by me describing how they can improve their sleep, this is medicine.
Yeah.
In its absolute form, in its purest form. But to drill down on why I think people have an issue with the term, I can understand that. I definitely recognize the controversy around the term food is, food as, food and medicine.
Can you explain it? Because to me, it's very clear that food is medicine. It doesn't mean other things are not medicine.
Yeah.
It's like there's lots of things, as you say, exercise, sleep is medicine, love is medicine, listening carefully and attentively to your patients is medicine, right? That's how I view it. So what do you think? Yeah, so explain where you think that there's validity to it potentially not being medicine.
Well, I think when people inappropriately try to suggest that food should be a replacement for all the other elements of medicine that we have at our disposal, all the pharmaceuticals, all the psychotherapy interventions, all the other aspects of what we just described as medicine. Yeah. I think that's where it becomes problematic, where it becomes food is an exclusive medicine. This is what we should be focusing on and nothing else. That's just...
I've not really seen that much though. Does anyone promote that? Like
I personally haven't seen that, but I've certainly heard of that. And there was a really impactful case that I came across as a junior doctor. I was working in renal medicine. I know you specialize in renal. She was on dialysis and she had a form of cancer. I forget the exact type now. This is going back about 8 years or so. And she'd completely taken herself off all medications at the advice of a healer who had suggested that all she needed to do was have these selection of foods. And so I think those isolated, and I have to stress it, it's an isolated case where people take the food is medicine to the extreme.
Yeah.
That's where it becomes problematic. But what I think what we're getting at here is there is sometimes on social media, a willful misinterpretation to try and taint someone on social media, right? And I think we've both been on the receiving end of comments and that kind of stuff. So I think that's where it becomes an issue. To further clarify what I think about in terms of food as medicine is we should look at it like a spectrum, right?
Yeah.
the majority of what I think I can do by helping people eat well consistently every day is preventative medicine. And this is the biggest bucket of food as medicine for me is preventative medicine. We have a bunch of studies to show that if you improve one's diet, increasing whole grains, increasing plants, etc., we can prevent a whole suite of different disease. There is another minority bucket where it's food as a supportive medicine, where it's alongside all the other things. And that can be alongside cancer therapies. It could be alongside psychotherapy, psychiatric therapies. It can be as part of recovery after having an elective procedure. Great, wonderful. Supportive medicine, something that we don't utilize a lot in medicine today. And then in the minority of cases, food is literally the sole medicine that we utilize. And there are some cases, even like, refractory childhood epilepsy, where we prescribe ketogenic diets that have some fantastic results in that isolated group of pediatric patients where food has been remarkable, absolutely remarkable. And so I think when we try to get to the nuance of what we mean by food as medicine, we display it like that spectrum, like I've described. It's quite hard to argue against that.
It is. I think it is nuanced. For me, I spent a lot of time thinking about food medicine. Is food medicine? So to me it is. And I've got to say, to having used that term with many of my patients for years, I found it to be helpful. And I feel I've never had any feedback from my patients saying, actually, that term is quite confusing for me. I don't like it. So I'm biased by my own experience with tens of thousands of patients. But for me, there's like literal, cultural, and philosophical reasons why I think food is medicine. Philosophically, I think we're living in an era now where about 80 to 90% of what we see as doctors is in some way related to our collective modern lifestyles. So therefore, if we don't give lifestyle and nutrition the same weight as pharmaceutical interventions, well, I say the same weights. If we don't talk about them in that way, it's always going to be deemed as inferior. That the classic case, someone comes in to see their doctor with a new diagnosis of type 2 diabetes. Doctor spends the first 9 minutes out of the 10 minutes talking about the blood results and metformin and the fact that you're going to need more medications and you'll end up on insulin. And then as you're walking out the door, and if you can just, maybe you go to the gym and change your diet a little bit, that may help. Well, what message does that patient get? It's like, there's diet and lifestyle there, but it's really about me taking this medication. So I think philosophically, given what we're now afflicted with, what's bankrupting healthcare systems all over the world, I think it's time to elevate the status of foods and lifestyle in terms of what we view as medicine. But also I think there's a cultural element to this, which you touched on with your mum. And I think to some cultures, certainly, we've got Indian backgrounds, this idea that food is not medicine is just an alien concept. I don't think my family would understand that. I don't think my grandparents would even understand the question. What do you mean? We were brought up in such a way that, I've got a slight cold at the moment. So what was I, literally before you arrived, I'm doing what my mum taught me to do when I was little, when I had a sore throat, which is, hot water, finely cut ginger, pepper, turmeric, and Manuka honey. That's literally what I was drinking all morning so that I can have this conversation with you. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely.
So I don't know if any of that fits with you or not, but that's
100%.
kind of my take on it and why I passionately believe it is. But I'll also, before you respond, I also want to say, look, if that term doesn't work for people as well, I'm okay with that.
Right? Totally.
If that doesn't fit your belief system, totally cool, but absolutely. I think it's hard to make the case that food isn't super, super powerful.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think I completely agree with that analogy of looking at food in those different elements, cultural philosophy. It's very, very ingrained in us, and it's very easy for us to understand. But certainly for someone who doesn't come from that background, who hasn't been brought up with that, I can understand why it can be a little bit off-putting for whatever reason. I get that. But for the reasons that we need to take nutritional medicine a lot more importantly, I think it's important, just as you said, to elevate the conversation around food in all environments, clinical, academic, culturally, day to day, the food environment. And if you just look at the stats, I mean, like 1 in 5 deaths globally, diet related, increasing the likelihood of mental health disorders by 43% if you're on a westernized diet. If you look at the number of cancers that are related to diet and lifestyle, it's around anywhere between 25 and 30%, depending on where you look at all these different sources from. The WHO, all these huge institutions are all recognizing the impact that diet is having. It can have conversely the positive impact as well. I'm an example of how that can be in an extreme way, but also just generally looking at, like you said, the issues that are afflicting healthcare systems globally and causing the most amount of cost and damage to people's livelihoods and their ability to live disability-free lives. It's having a huge impact. And that's why we need to talk about it a lot more. I wanted to talk a little bit more about my issues at the start as to the reasons as to why I might have improved my own condition. Because I realized we left the listener thinking about inflammation, the microbiota, and the micronutrients that I may have been replacing. And I think looking at blood work, just to tie a knot on this, thinking about the blood work that I was offered at the time, it was pretty standard, but not really robust in terms of looking at all the different micronutrients that could have been off whack. And there's no real way of showing that now, but I know from my own research, vitamin E, certain types of B vitamins, magnesium, even omega-3 at low levels can predispose or at least have an association with heart irregularities.
Wow.
So had I just through chance improve those through diet, it's hard to say. I did try some supplements at the same time as well, but I think that's an important part of the story. If you enjoyed that video, you'll love the library of content that we have on thedoctorskitchen.com. Make sure you hit subscribe, and we have podcasts in our library on brain health, well-being, supplements, and lots more. Have a wonderful day.